Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the shadowed corridors of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle into your most comfortable position, to let the weight of the day slowly dissolve, as we explore one of humanity's darkest chapters, a time when justice wore the familiar face of your neighbor, when the very people you shared your daily bread with could become the instruments of your doom. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine a world where the law was not some distant, impartial force, but something that lived and breathed in every household, in every gathering, in every whispered conversation between friends. A world where ordinary people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, were not merely subject to the law, but were the law itself, bound by ancient codes to police, judge, and execute their own communities. Over the next 2 hours, we'll journey through medieval England's suffocating system of collective justice. Meet the notorious Matthew Hopkins, whose reign of terror claimed hundreds of lives. Uncover the archaeological secrets buried beneath centuries of soil, and finally witness how the elite twisted these communal bonds into weapons of personal gain. So breathe deeply, let your muscles relax, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries to a time when your greatest fear was not some distant authority, but the very people who lived beside you, who knew your habits, your secrets, your fears. Let us begin our journey into the world where neighbors became executioners, where community meant complicity, and where justice was anything but blind. Imagine yourself waking in the pre-dawn darkness of a winter morning in the year 1347. You lie on a simple straw mattress, your wife beside you, your children huddled together for warmth on their own pallet across the single room of your wattle and daub cottage. The walls, made of woven branches packed with mud and dung, do little to keep out the penetrating cold, and your breath forms small clouds in the frigid air. But it's not the cold that has awakened you. It's a sound, that dreaded sound that every person in your village knows and fears. The hue and cry. A wordless shriek that begins with one voice, then two, then spreads like wildfire through the clustered homes of your small community. Someone has committed a crime, and now the ancient machinery of the Frank Pledge system grinds into motion. You rise quickly, pulling on your rough woolen tunic and hose, knowing that hesitation could be interpreted as guilt. Your wife's eyes meet yours in the darkness, reflecting the same fear that churns in your stomach. You both know what the hue and cry means. As a member of a tithing, a group of 10 households bound together by law, you are responsible not just for your own conduct, but for the behavior of 9 other men and their families. The Frank Pledge system, imposed by the Norman conquerors nearly 3 centuries ago, has woven a web of mutual responsibility so tight that no one can escape its threads. You think of the 9 other men in your tithing as you hastily wrap your feet in cloth strips and pull on your worn leather shoes. There's William the miller, whose temper when drunk is legendary. John the carpenter, whose debts grow larger each season. Thomas the field worker, whose hungry children have been seen near the Lord's rabbit warren. And 6 others, each with their own weaknesses, their own temptations, their own potential for dragging you all into disaster. As you step outside into the bitter morning air, you see your neighbors emerging from their own homes, some still pulling on clothes, all moving toward the source of the cry. The system demands immediate response. To ignore the hue and cry is itself a crime, punishable by fines you cannot afford or worse. The very foundation of law in your world rests not on distant judges or professional constables, but on you and your neighbors, bound together in an inescapable web of collective responsibility. You fall in a step with Robert, another member of your tithing, and without speaking, you both quicken your pace. The Frank Pledge system has made you brothers-in-law, if not in blood. If Robert commits murder and flees, you could hang for it. If you steal and escape, Robert's family could starve from the fines. This is the terrible arithmetic of collective justice. Every crime multiplies, spreading guilt like a plague through the bonds of legal brotherhood. The crowd gathers in the muddy space between the church and the manor house, where Henry the Reeve stands with his staff of office. Beside him, you see young Martin, barely 16, held firmly by two men. His face is pale with terror, and blood stains his rough tunic. Near the church wall lies a body, Edgar the tanner, his head split open, his blood already congealing in the cold morning air. Your heart sinks. Edgar was not well liked. His prices were high, his manner surly, and rumors suggested he diluted his solutions to cheat customers. But none of that matters now. A murder has been committed, and Martin belongs to your tithing. The implications crash over you like a physical blow. If Martin is found guilty, if he flees, if the case goes badly, you and the other 8 men of your tithing could face consequences ranging from crippling fines to execution. The Reeve begins the formal process, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The hue and cry has been raised. Edgar the tanner lies dead. Martin of the tithing of William Miller stands accused. Let the community bear witness, and let justice be done according to the customs of our fathers. This is how justice works in your world. There are no police to investigate, no professional judges to weigh evidence. There is only the community, bound by ancient law to serve as detective, jury, and executioner. The very people you see at church each Sunday, who you buy bread from, who help you bring in the harvest. These are the people who will decide Martin's fate, and by extension, perhaps your own. The Frank Pledge system emerged from the Anglo-Saxon tradition of collective responsibility, refined and brutalized by Norman efficiency. Every male over the age of 12 must belong to a tithing or be declared an outlaw, literally outside the law's protection, able to be killed on sight like a wolf. Twice each year, at the view of Frank Pledge, you stand before the manor court and swear sacred oaths for the behavior of your tithing members. The oath echoes in your memory as you watch Martin tremble before the assembled village. I swear by God and by the saints that I will be faithful and true to my Lord and to my tithing, and that I will not know of any theft or murder or other felony without raising the hue and cry and pursuing the malefactor, and that I will be ready to do justice according to the custom of the manor. These are not empty words. The system enforces them with brutal efficiency. Just last year, in the neighboring village of Thornbury, an entire tithing was fined into destitution because one member stole a cow and fled. The year before that, 3 men hanged because they failed to prevent their tithing member from committing murder. The law makes no distinction between guilt by action and guilt by association. As the initial investigation begins, you watch your neighbors transform into instruments of justice. The blacksmith who yesterday shared ale with you now examines the wound on Edgar's head with clinical detachment. The baker's wife, who gossips cheerfully at the well each morning, testifies about seeing Martin arguing with Edgar the previous evening. The priest, who blessed your children, now speaks of God's judgment and the necessity of discovering truth through ordeal if needed. The bourse-holder of your tithing, William the miller, elected to serve as your chief, steps forward to speak for Martin. This is his duty and his burden. As bourse-holder, William has the power to arrest any member of the tithing, to search their homes, to compel their appearance at court. Now he must defend one of his charges or participate in his condemnation. William's voice is steady, but you can see the sweat on his brow despite the cold. Martin is a good lad, he begins. He has never shown violence before. He says Edgar attacked him first, that he defended himself only. But even as William speaks, you can see the doubt in the faces around you. Self-defense is a dangerous claim. The law recognizes it in principle, but demands proof that is almost impossible to provide. The Reeve nods slowly. Let Martin speak for himself. The boy steps forward, his voice breaking with fear. Edgar, he accused me of stealing leather from a shop. He said he would see me hanged. He came at me with his knife. I pushed him away, and he fell. His head struck the corner of the horse trough. I swear by all the saints, I never meant to kill him. A murmur runs through the crowd. Some faces show sympathy, others skepticism. You know that what happens next depends not on abstract principles of justice, but on the collective will of your neighbors, on old grudges and new alliances, on fear and favor, and the terrible knowledge that any one of you could be standing where Martin stands now. The Reeve consults with the manor steward, then turns back to the assembly. The matter is grave. Blood has been shed. The boy claims self-defense, but Edgar cannot speak to contradict him. According to our custom, if the community cannot determine guilt through witness and testimony, the matter must be decided by ordeal. Your stomach clenches. Trial by ordeal. The judgment of God, they call it, though you sometimes wonder if God truly involves himself in such earthly brutalities. You've seen ordeals before, been forced to participate in them. The memory of Thomas, the poacher's screams, as he carried the hot iron still haunts your dreams. The image of Alice, accused of witchcraft, sinking beneath the murky water of the village pond while the community watched, is burned into your mind. But this is your world, where divine judgment is sought through physical torture, where guilt or innocence is determined by whether wounds fester or heal, whether bodies float or sink. And you, ordinary villager that you are, must be part of it. The law demands not just your compliance, but your active participation. The sun has risen now, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. The morning's work waits, fields to tend, animals to feed, crafts to practice. But justice, in its brutal communal form, takes precedence. The reeve announces that the ordeal will take place in 3 days, giving time for the wounds to show God's judgment if Martin chooses trial by hot iron, or for the proper preparations if he chooses trial by water. As the crowd begins to disperse, you catch the eye of your tithing members. Without speaking, you all understand that you must meet, must discuss what Martin's fate means for all of you. If he's found guilty, you'll all face fines. If he flees before the ordeal, the consequences could be far worse. Some of you have families who depend on your labor. Some have debts that additional fines would make impossible to pay. Some are already on the edge of survival. This is the cruelest aspect of the frank pledge system. It turns natural human bonds into chains of mutual destruction. Your neighbor's crime becomes your punishment. Your friend's moment of weakness becomes your family's starvation. The system forces you to become your brother's keeper in the most literal and terrifying sense. You return home to find your wife feeding the children their morning porridge, a thin gruel of barley and water, flavored with a precious pinch of salt. She looks at you questioningly, and you shake your head slightly. Not in front of the children, but she understands. The shadow of Martin's crime has fallen across your household, as it has across 8 others. Later, as you work in the fields you rent from the lord of the manor, your mind turns over the implications. The frank pledge system controls every aspect of your daily life. You cannot travel beyond the manor's boundaries without permission from your tithing. You cannot brew ale without a license that your neighbors must approve. You cannot gather deadwood from the forest without risking accusation and punishment. You cannot even miss church without facing fines that would take weeks of labor to pay. The system watches you through 1,000 eyes. Your neighbors observe whether you attend Mass, whether you work on holy days, whether you speak respectfully of your betters. The manor court meets every 3 weeks, and at each session, the tithings must report on their members. Have you maintained the roads as required? Have you allowed your animals to stray onto the Lord's land? Have you failed to raise the hue and cry when witnessing a crime? Each infraction carries its penalty, enforced not by some distant authority, but by your own community. The stocks and pillory that stand in the center of the village are not mere symbols of justice. They are tools that your neighbors will use to punish you. The brands and maiming knives are kept by the blacksmith, ready to mark thieves and liars. The gallows at the crossroads outside the village stands as a constant reminder that your neighbors can, under the law, become your executioners. You think of the various punishments you've witnessed, been forced to participate in. For missing church, Richard the swineherd spent 6 hours in the stocks while his neighbors pelted him with rotten vegetables and dung. For brewing ale without a license, Margaret stood in the pillory for a full day, her head and hands locked in place while the sun burned her face and the rain soaked her to the skin. For stealing a loaf of bread, young Tom had his ear cut off, the blacksmith heating the iron to cauterize the wound while the boy's screams echoed across the village. But these are the lighter punishments. For more serious crimes, the community must enforce harsher measures. You remember the horror of watching John the Vagabond being branded on the forehead with the letter V for vagrancy, the smell of burning flesh making several onlookers vomit. You remember Ellen, convicted of petty theft for the third time, having her hand struck off at the wrist, the executioner chosen by lot from among the village men. And worst of all, you remember the hangings. Not carried out by some professional executioner from a distant city, but by your own neighbors, men chosen from the community to pull the rope, to kick away the stool, to watch as the condemned slowly strangled. The law requires witnesses from each tithing, forces you to watch as justice, if it can be called that, is done. The Frank Pledge system makes everyone complicit. When Thomas the poacher was hanged for killing the Lord's deer, it was his own cousin who had to pull the rope, tears streaming down his face. When Margaret was burned for witchcraft, it was the women of the village who gathered the wood, who had searched her body for devil's marks, who stood watching as the flames consumed her. This complicity serves a purpose you understand with the bitter wisdom of experience. It makes rebellion against the system almost impossible. How can you protest a law that makes you its instrument? How can you resist a justice system that operates through your own hands? The genius of the Frank Pledge system is that it makes every person both victim and oppressor, both judged and judge. As the day wears on, you meet with your tithing members in the mill after dark. The great wooden wheel is still the grinding stone silent. By flickering candlelight, 10 worried faces consider Martin's fate and what it means for all of you. William the miller, your borsholder, speaks first. The boy swears it was self-defense. I've known him since birth. He's not violent by nature. Edgar was a cheat and a bully, adds Robert the Thatcher. Half the village had grievances against him. That may be true, says John the carpenter, his voice heavy with worry. But Edgar is dead, and the law cares nothing for his character. If Martin is found guilty, we all suffer. I already owe 3 months' rent. Additional fines would see my family thrown from our home. The discussion continues long into the night. Some argue for believing Martin, for supporting him through the ordeal. Others, thinking of their own families, suggest more pragmatic approaches. Perhaps Martin could be convinced to flee, but no. If he runs, you all face severe punishment, possibly death. Perhaps witnesses could be found to support his story, but false testimony carries its own terrible penalties. This is the diabolic arithmetic of collective justice. Every decision must be weighed not just on its moral merits, but on its potential consequences for innocent families. The system forces good people to make evil calculations, to weigh a boy's life against their children's survival. You return home near midnight, exhausted in body and spirit. Your wife is still awake, spinning wool by the dying fire. She doesn't ask what was decided. She knows that some burdens are better not shared. But as you lie beside her on your straw mattress, you both know that sleep will not come easily. In 3 days, Martin will face his ordeal, and your fate is bound to his as surely as if you shared the same blood. The medieval world offers no escape from this system. You cannot simply leave. Departure without permission makes you an outlaw, free to be killed by anyone. You cannot appeal to higher authority. The lord of the manor benefits from the Frank Pledge system, which maintains order without costing him money for professional law enforcement. You cannot reform it from within. The system has endured for centuries, refined by generations of rulers who understood that making people police themselves is far more effective than external force. You think of your children sleeping peacefully nearby. What world are you leaving them? They too will be bound into tithings when they come of age. They too will swear oaths that make them responsible for their neighbor's sins. They too will be forced to participate in the brutal theater of communal justice. The cycle continues, generation after generation, a wheel of mutual suffering that grinds all beneath it. In the darkness, you hear the wind rattling your shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howls. You wonder if Martin hears it too, if he lies awake contemplating the ordeal to come. You wonder if Edgar's family mourns him despite his faults, if they take comfort in the promise of justice or fear the poverty that his death brings. You wonder if anyone in your small world sleeps peacefully, or if all lie awake, contemplating the web of law and custom that binds you all together. This is life under the Frank Pledge system, a life where your neighbors hold your fate in their hands, where community means complicity, where the law lives not in books or courtrooms, but in the watching eyes and ready hands of everyone around you. It is a system designed to create perfect social control through mutual fear, and in that goal, it succeeds all too well. The irony does not escape you. The very bonds that should unite a community, neighborly care, mutual support, shared celebration, and mourning, have been twisted into chains of control. Love becomes surveillance, friendship becomes liability, community becomes prison. The Frank Pledge system takes the natural human need for connection and weaponizes it, turning every relationship into a potential source of legal and mortal danger. As dawn approaches, you rise again, beginning another day in this web of collective responsibility. Martin's ordeal draws closer, and with it, the moment when you and your neighbors must once again become the instruments of justice. Whether he proves innocent or guilty, whether he lives or dies, you will all bear the weight of participation. You dress in the pre-dawn darkness, careful not to wake your family. Soon enough, they will learn what new burden Martin's fate places upon your household. Soon enough, your children will understand that in this world, you could be punished for crimes you didn't commit, judged by neighbors who fear their own judgment, executed by friends who weep as they carry out the law's demands. Outside, the village begins to stir. Smoke rises from chimneys as fires are rekindled. The crow of a rooster announces the new day. Everything appears normal, peaceful even. But beneath the surface of daily life runs the constant current of fear, the knowledge that at any moment, the hue and cry might sound again, and the terrible machinery of communal justice might turn its attention to you. This is your world, a world where neighbors become executioners, where justice wears familiar faces, where the law lives in the very fabric of community life. It is a world that would terrify those who live in later ages, accustomed to impersonal justice and professional law enforcement. But for you, it is simply reality, brutal, inescapable, and enduring. The Frank Pledge system would continue for centuries more, binding generation after generation in its web of mutual responsibility. Only slowly, gradually, would it give way to more modern forms of law enforcement. But for now, in this moment, in this small village in medieval England, it reigns supreme, making every person both guardian and potential executioner of their neighbor. As you begin your day's labor, you carry with you the weight of this knowledge. Tonight, you will meet again with your tithing. Tomorrow, preparations for Martin's ordeal will begin. And in 3 days, you will stand with your neighbors and watch as God's judgment, or mere chance, determines not just Martin's fate, but perhaps your own. This is the price of community in the medieval world, the terrible cost of belonging. The sun rises higher, casting its light on a village that appears peaceful but seethes with hidden tensions. Every person you pass carries their own fears, their own calculations, their own desperate hopes that the hue and cry will not sound for them. This is life under the Frank Pledge system, a life of perpetual vigilance, mutual suspicion, and the knowledge that your greatest danger comes not from strangers or foreign enemies, but from the very people who share your daily bread. And so the cycle continues, as it has for centuries, as it will for centuries more. The Frank Pledge system endures because it works, not to create justice, perhaps, but to maintain order through fear. It endures because it makes everyone complicit, everyone guilty, everyone afraid. It endures because it turns the natural bonds of community into the strongest chains ever forged by law. As you work through the day, the weight of these chains is always present. They bind you to your tithing, to your village, to a system that makes you both victim and enforcer. They are invisible but unbreakable, forged not of iron, but of oath and custom, and the terrible knowledge that in this world, your neighbor's crime can become your death sentence, and your neighbor's hands can become the instruments of your execution. In the summer of 1644, in the small Essex town of Manningtree, a failed lawyer sat in his modest lodgings, nursing his bitterness and his ale. Matthew Hopkins, gentleman, as he styled himself, had little to show for his 24 years of life. His legal career had foundered before it began. His small inheritance dwindled with each passing month, and his prospects seemed as dim as the candlelight that flickered in his rented room. But on this particular evening, something changed. Through the thin walls of his lodging, Hopkins heard voices, women's voices, speaking in hushed tones about meetings in the dead of night, about strange familiars that came to them in the form of animals, about a dark figure who promised them power in exchange for their souls. Whether Hopkins truly heard such conversations, or whether his troubled mind conjured them from fragments of gossip and superstition, we cannot know. What we do know is that from this moment, Matthew Hopkins found his calling, his purpose, and ultimately his doom. Within 3 years, this obscure failure would become the most feared man in Eastern England. He would send more accused witches to the gallows than all other English witch hunters combined. Nearly 300 souls would perish because of his accusations, his methods, his relentless pursuit of what he claimed was divine justice. He would style himself Witch-Finder General, though no authority ever granted him such a title. He would grow rich from the terror he sowed, charging towns and villages 20 shillings per witch, a month's wages for a common laborer. And then, as suddenly as he had risen, he would fall, dying in his bed at the age of 27, his body racked with consumption, his legacy one of blood and fear and questions that echo through the centuries. To understand Matthew Hopkins, we must first understand the world that created him. England in 1644 was a nation tearing itself apart. The civil war between King Charles I and Parliament had been raging for 2 years. Brother fought brother, father fought son, and the old certainties of life had crumbled like ancient parchment. In such times of chaos and upheaval, people seek explanations for their sufferings, scapegoats for their fears. And in the figure of the witch, that ancient enemy of Christian society, they found both. The belief in witchcraft was not some quaint superstition relegated to the ignorant peasantry. King James I himself had written a treatise on demonology. Learned theologians debated the nature of demonic pacts with the same seriousness they applied to matters of Scripture. The law of the land, the Witchcraft Act of 1604, made consorting with evil spirits a capital crime. In this atmosphere of learned credulity and legal sanction, a man like Matthew Hopkins could flourish. But Hopkins brought something new to the ancient fear of witches, a systematic approach, a businessman's efficiency, and a set of scientific methods that gave his accusations the veneer of objective truth. He did not rely on hysterical accusations or mob justice. Instead, he developed a methodology, a process that could be replicated, taught to others, and, most importantly, sold to frightened communities for a handsome profit. Let us return to that summer evening in 1644, when Hopkins first claimed to have overheard the witches of Manningtree. According to his own account, published later in his book, The Discovery of Witches, he heard Elizabeth Clark, a one-legged elderly woman, speaking with other women about their supernatural dealings. Hopkins, displaying the initiative that would characterize his brief career, did not simply report these overheard conversations to the authorities. Instead, he took it upon himself to investigate, to gather evidence, to build a case. He began with Elizabeth Clark, approaching the local magistrates with his suspicions. The justices, perhaps influenced by the chaos of the times, perhaps genuinely convinced by Hopkins' earnest manner, granted him permission to examine the accused woman. And here, Hopkins deployed the first of his innovative methods, the watching. The watching was simplicity itself, yet devastating in its effects. The accused, which would be placed in a room, seated on a stool or table, and watched continuously by Hopkins and his assistants. She would be kept awake, denied sleep for days at a time. The theory, as Hopkins explained it, was that the witch's familiar spirits, those demonic creatures that did her bidding, would be compelled to visit her. Without sleep, exhausted beyond endurance, the mind begins to fragment, to hallucinate, to confess to anything if only to be allowed rest. Elizabeth Clark, after days of this torment, began to speak of her familiars. She gave them names, strange, otherworldly names that Hopkins carefully recorded. There was Holt, who came in the likeness of a white kitten. Jarmara, who appeared as a fat spaniel without any legs. Vinegar Tom, who manifested as a long-legged greyhound with a head like an ox. Sack and Sugar, who came as a black rabbit. News, who appeared as a polecat. These names, so specific, so unusual, seemed to Hopkins and the magistrates proof positive of supernatural dealings. Modern minds might recognize in these confessions the desperate ramblings of a sleep-deprived elderly woman, possibly naming actual animals she had seen or owned, transformed by exhaustion and fear into demonic familiars. But to Hopkins and his contemporaries, they were evidence of the most damning kind. Elizabeth Clark was tried, convicted, and hanged, along with several other women she had named under torture as her confederates in witchcraft. This first success launched Hopkins' career. Word spread quickly through the troubled counties of eastern England. Here was a man who could identify witches, who had methods to make them confess, who could cleanse a community of evil in its midst. And Hopkins, recognizing opportunity, began to refine and expand his services. He recruited assistants, most notably John Stern, who would become his constant companion and fellow witch hunter. Together, they developed what might be called the Hopkins method, a suite of techniques designed to identify, examine, and extract confessions from accused witches. Each technique had its rationale, its procedure, and its particular horror. First came the identification. Hopkins did not wait for accusations to come to him. Instead, he and Stern would arrive in a town or village, often at the invitation of local authorities who had heard of their reputation. They would begin by gathering intelligence. Who in the community was unpopular, who was elderly and alone, who had perhaps been heard muttering to themselves or keeping too many cats. The profile of a witch, as Hopkins constructed it, was broad enough to encompass anyone who deviated from social norms. Once suspects were identified, the examination would begin. Hopkins insisted on searching the accused for witches' marks, any unusual blemish, mole, or imperfection on the skin that might serve as a teat for suckling familiar spirits. This search required stripping the accused naked, examining every inch of their body, often in the presence of multiple witnesses. The humiliation was part of the process, breaking down resistance, establishing dominance. Hopkins employed specialists called prickers who used long needles to test these marks. The theory held that a true witch's mark would feel no pain and would not bleed when pricked. Of course, repeated pricking would eventually find spots where nerve damage, scar tissue, or simple numbness would produce the desired lack of response. Some prickers were known to use retractable needles, ensuring they could always find a devil's mark when needed. Then came the watching, which we have already described. Days without sleep, constant observation, repeated questioning. The human mind, deprived of rest, begins to malfunction. Reality blurs, suggestion becomes memory, and the desperate need for the torment to end overrides all other considerations. Under such conditions, accusations multiplied. The accused would name others, who would in turn be arrested and subjected to the same treatment, creating an ever-widening circle of terror. But perhaps Hopkins' most infamous innovation was his use of the swimming test. Based on the ancient belief that water, being pure, would reject evil, Hopkins refined this into a precise procedure. The accused, which would be bound, right thumb to left toe, left thumb to right toe, and lowered into water. If she floated, the water was rejecting her evil nature, proving her guilt. If she sank, she was innocent, though by the time she was pulled out, she might well have drowned. Hopkins claimed this test was foolproof and merciful. He wrote in his defense that the accused were always retrieved quickly, that drowning was never the intent. But account from the time suggest otherwise. Mary Sutton of Bedford was subjected to the swimming test repeatedly, thrown into the water again and again until she finally floated enough to satisfy her accusers. She was hanged shortly thereafter. The business model Hopkins developed was as innovative as his methods. He charged communities a flat fee plus expenses, making witch hunting profitable. In an era when a farm laborer might earn sixpence a day, Hopkins charged 20 shillings per witch, 20 days' wages. In some cases, he and Stern might clear hundreds of pounds from a single visit to a troubled town. They traveled in style, stayed in the best accommodations, ate well while their victims starved in custody. The financial incentive created a perverse dynamic. The more witches Hopkins found, the more he earned. Communities that had invited him, having already paid his fees, felt pressure to validate their expenditure by producing guilty verdicts. Local authorities who had endorsed his visit could not afford to have him find no witches. What would that say about their judgment? And so the machinery of accusation ground on, fueled by fear, superstition, and cold economic calculation. Let us follow Hopkins and Stern on one of their typical investigations to the town of Chelmsford in July 1645. They arrived with great fanfare, their reputation preceding them. The local justices had prepared a list of suspects, mostly elderly women, some widowed, some poor, all in some way marginal to the community. Over the course of a few days, Hopkins and his team examined these women, searching for marks, conducting their watches, extracting confessions. The confessions followed a pattern that Hopkins had come to expect. The accused would speak of meeting the devil, usually described as a tall man in black clothing. They would describe signing their names in his book, sometimes in blood. They would name their familiars, always with those strange, specific names that seemed to prove supernatural origin. They would implicate others, spreading the web of accusation through the community. On July 29th, 1645, 19 women were hanged at Chelmsford. The executions were public, attended by hundreds who came to see divine justice done. Hopkins and Stern watched from a position of honor. Their work complete, their fees collected. They left town the next day, moving on to the next community that required their services. The scale of Hopkins' operations expanded rapidly. In 1645 and 1646, he and his associates were responsible for more witch trials and executions than England had seen in the previous century. Town after town fell under his scrutiny. Berry Street, Edmonds, saw 18 executions in a single day. Aldborough lost 7 citizens after Hopkins spent mere hours in the town. Great Yarmouth, King's Lynn, Stowmarket. The list of communities touched by his deadly expertise grew ever longer. But Hopkins was not without his methods of self-justification. He saw himself as a servant of God, doing divine work in troubled times. He wrote extensively about his methods, defending them against critics who began to emerge as the death toll mounted. His book, The Discovery of Witches, published in 1647, is a remarkable document, part manual, part apologia, part business advertisement. In it, Hopkins addresses various criticisms with a lawyer's skill for argumentation, even if his legal career had never flourished. To those who said his methods were torture, he replied that he never used violence, only watching and waiting for the truth to emerge. To those who questioned the swimming test, he provided theological justifications and claims of careful procedure. To those who wondered at the strange names of familiars, he offered these as proof of supernatural origin. What human imagination could conjure such appellations? He also revealed much about his own psychology. Hopkins writes of himself as chosen by God for this work, of receiving special providence in his ability to detect witches. He describes dreams and visions that confirmed his mission. There is in his writing a combination of absolute certainty and defensive anxiety, the voice of a man who must convince others because he must convince himself. As 1646 progressed, Hopkins' reign of terror reached its peak. He had expanded his operations, training others in his methods, creating what amounted to a franchise system of witch hunting. Communities across East Anglia lived in fear, not just of witches, but of the witch-finder himself. For who was safe when any unusual behavior, any physical imperfection, any neighborhood dispute could lead to accusation, examination, and the gallows? The impact on communities was devastating. Families were torn apart as members accused one another under torture. Local economies suffered as productive members of society were imprisoned or executed. Social bonds frayed as neighbors viewed each other with suspicion, wondering who might name them in their desperation to end their own torment. The very fabric of rural life, already strained by civil war, threatened to unravel entirely. But even as Hopkins reached the height of his power, the forces that would bring about his downfall were gathering. The sheer scale of the executions began to trouble even those who believed in the reality of witchcraft. Puritan ministers, who might have been expected to support the witch hunts, began to speak out against the methods used. Questions arose about the swimming test, about the reliability of confessions extracted through sleep deprivation, about the convenient profitability of finding witches. One of the most significant critics was John Gowl, a clergyman from Huntingdonshire. In 1646, he published Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcrafts, a direct challenge to Hopkins' methods. Gowl did not deny the existence of witches, but he questioned whether Hopkins' techniques actually identified them or simply tortured innocent people into false confessions. He pointed out the suspicious financial motivations, the lack of proper legal authority, the violation of Christian charity in the treatment of the accused. Hopkins responded with characteristic vehemence, but the damage was done. Other voices joined Gowl's, questioning not just methods but results. Why did witches seem to proliferate wherever Hopkins went? Why did confessions follow such similar patterns? Why were the accused overwhelmingly poor, elderly women without powerful friends or family to defend them? The political situation also shifted. As the Civil War moved toward its conclusion with Parliament's victory, there was a desire for restoration of normal legal procedures. The arbitrary justice of the witch trials, conducted often without proper judicial oversight, began to seem as dangerous as the witchcraft it purported to combat. Local magistrates who had invited Hopkins began to distance themselves from his activities. By early 1647, Hopkins' career was effectively over. The commissions dried up, the invitations ceased. Communities that might once have welcomed him now barred their gates. The man who had held the power of life and death over hundreds found himself returning to Manningtree, to the modest lodgings where it had all begun. But retirement brought no peace to Matthew Hopkins. The consumption that would kill him was already advancing, eating away at his lungs. Some said it was divine judgment, that God had marked the false accuser with disease. Others whispered darker theories, that the witches he had persecuted had cursed him, that their familiars visited him in his sickness, that he suffered the torments he had inflicted on others. Hopkins spent his final months writing his book, defending his legacy, trying to fix in history his version of events. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood servant of righteousness, a man who had sacrificed his health and reputation in the service of God and country. But even as he wrote, the legends were already forming. The most persistent legend, one that arose almost immediately after his death, was that Hopkins had himself been subjected to his own swimming test and found to be a witch. The story, almost certainly false, held that the people of Manningtree, finally seeing through his deceptions, had bound him and thrown him into the village pond. When he floated, as a bound person might well do, he was declared a witch and executed. The historical Hopkins died in his bed, probably in August 1647, his body consumed by tuberculosis. He was buried in the church at Mistley, though the exact location of his grave is unknown. Some say this is because his burial was kept secret to prevent desecration. Others suggest that, even in death, the community wanted no permanent memorial to the man who had brought such terror to their lives. But what of Hopkins' legacy? In the immediate aftermath of his death, the witch hunts largely ceased. His methods, so carefully documented, were discredited. The spectacle of nearly 300 executions in 3 years had shocked even a society that believed in witchcraft. England would see no more mass witch hunts, though isolated trials continued for several decades. Yet Hopkins' influence extended beyond England's shores. His book found its way to New England, where Puritan colonists facing their own anxieties and conflicts would find in it a template for identifying and prosecuting witches. The Salem witch trials of 1692, though occurring 45 years after Hopkins' death, bore the unmistakable marks of his methods. The searching for which marks, the emphasis on spectral evidence, the extraction of confessions through physical and psychological pressure. In examining the phenomenon of Matthew Hopkins, we must ask how one failed lawyer could cause such devastation. Part of the answer lies in the man himself, his intelligence, his systematic approach, his ability to present himself as an authority. But the larger part lies in the society that empowered him. Hopkins appeared at a moment when traditional authorities were weakened, when communities were desperate for explanations for their sufferings, when fear overrode reason and greed overcame mercy. The Witchfinder General, as Hopkins styled himself, was in many ways a modern figure operating in a medieval context. He industrialized witch hunting, turning it from sporadic local persecution into a systematic, profitable enterprise. He created methods that could be taught and replicated. He understood the power of documentation, of appearing scientific and objective. He grasped the psychology of fear and how to exploit it for personal gain. Consider the typical victim of Hopkins' accusations. Elizabeth Clark, whom we met at the beginning of this narrative, serves as an archetype. Elderly, disabled, poor, without powerful protectors, she embodied the vulnerability that Hopkins exploited. In a society where women's power was strictly limited, where age brought not respect but suspicion, where physical imperfection was seen as possible mark of divine disfavor, women like Clark were perfect targets. The names of Hopkins' victims form a litany of the forgotten. And West and Rebecca West, mother and daughter, hang together at Bury St. Edmunds. John Lowes, the elderly vicar of Brandiston, forced to confess to sinking ships with witchcraft. Mary Lakeland, burned alive for allegedly bewitching her husband to death. Each had their own story, their own life cut short by accusation and manufactured evidence. But we must also consider Hopkins' enablers, the magistrates who authorized his investigations, the communities that paid his fees, the crowds that attended the executions. Without their participation, Hopkins would have remained an obscure failure. The witch hunt was not imposed from above, but emerged from below, from communities turning on their most vulnerable members in times of crisis. The economic aspect of Hopkins' career deserves particular attention. In 3 years, he and his associates likely earned thousands of pounds, a fortune by the standards of the time. This blood money came from communities already impoverished by war, paid out of public funds that might have gone to poor relief or reconstruction. The commercialization of persecution created incentives for its continuation, turning human misery into profit. Hopkins' techniques, too, merit close examination for what they reveal about the construction of guilt. The watching, the pricking, the swimming. Each created conditions where innocence became impossible to prove. Sleep deprivation produced confessions that seemed voluntary. The search for marks found evidence on every human body. The swimming test created a double bind where any outcome confirmed guilt. These were not methods of investigation, but of manufacture, designed to produce witches rather than discover them. The psychological impact on communities subjected to Hopkins' investigations cannot be overstated. Trust, the essential bond of rural life, was shattered. Any peculiarity of behavior, any physical oddity, any neighborhood dispute could lead to accusation. Women stopped keeping cats, lest they be seen as familiars. The elderly confined themselves to their homes to avoid suspicion. Traditional healing practices, the province of wise women for generations, became evidence of diabolical knowledge. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of Hopkins' career was its veneer of legality and propriety. He did not lead torch-bearing mobs or conduct midnight raids. He worked with local authorities, documented his findings, followed what he claimed were proper procedures. The horror was bureaucratized, systematized, made respectable. This transformation of persecution into process would echo through history, showing how evil becomes most effective when it wears the mask of law and order. As Hopkins lay dying in 1647, did he reflect on the lives he had destroyed? Did the faces of the hanged visit him in his fevered dreams? His writings suggest not. To the end, he maintained his righteousness, his conviction that he had served God's purpose. This absolute certainty, this inability to doubt his own actions despite the mounting evidence of their injustice, marks Hopkins as a particular type of historical monster, the ideologue whose certainty makes him immune to compassion. The consumption that killed him was a disease of poverty and overcrowding, spread in the very communities he had torn apart. There is a grim poetry in this. The Witchfinder general killed by a malady that thrived in the social conditions his persecutions had worsened. His death at 27 meant he never lived to see his methods fully discredited, never faced earthly justice for his crimes. In the years following Hopkins' death, England gradually turned away from witch hunting. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 brought a new skepticism about supernatural claims. The rise of scientific thinking challenged the intellectual foundations of witch belief. By the early 18th century, witchcraft accusations were more likely to be met with ridicule than rope. But the shadow cast by Matthew Hopkins stretched long. His book remained in circulation, consulted by those who still believed. His methods influenced later persecutions, both of supposed witches and other marginal groups. Most significantly, he had demonstrated how easily fear could be monetized, how readily communities could be turned against their weakest members, how effectively persecution could be systematized. The historical Matthew Hopkins remains somewhat enigmatic. We have his writings, the court records of trials he influenced, account from contemporaries both supportive and critical. But the inner man, his true motivations, his private doubts, his personal demons, remains hidden. Was he a cynical fraud who discovered a profitable trade in fear? A religious fanatic who genuinely believed he was doing God's work? A damaged individual working out personal traumas through public persecution? Perhaps he was all of these, or none. What we can say with certainty is that Matthew Hopkins represents a recurring type in human history. The individual who appears at moments of social crisis to channel fear into violence, who provides simple answers to complex problems, who offers communities a way to externalize their anxieties on vulnerable scapegoats. His specific target was witches, but the pattern he embodied transcends any particular persecution. The England that created Matthew Hopkins was a nation at war with itself, where traditional certainties had collapsed and new ones had not yet emerged. In this chaos, a failed lawyer with a systematic mind and an absence of mercy could reinvent himself as an agent of divine justice. That he found so many willing to empower and enable him speaks not just to the superstitions of the age, but to deeper human tendencies toward fear, conformity, and the persecution of difference. As we consider Hopkins' career, its meteoric rise and sudden fall, its devastating impact and contested legacy, we might reflect on how thin the line between civilization and barbarity can be. It took only one determined individual, operating in conducive circumstances, to turn neighbor against neighbor, to transform law into lawlessness, to make murder respectable. The institutional and social failures that allowed Hopkins to flourish were not unique to 17th century England. The victims of Matthew Hopkins deserve to be remembered not as witches, but as human beings caught in a historical tragedy. Elizabeth Clark, the one-legged old woman whose overheard conversations began Hopkins' career. The 19 hanged at Chelmsford on that July day. The 18 executed at Bury St. Edmunds. The countless others whose names appear only in court records, reduced to their alleged crimes and manufactured confessions. Each was someone's mother, daughter, sister, friend. Each had hopes, fears, daily routines, small pleasures. Full human lives reduced to caricature and then to corpses. In death, Hopkins achieved a different kind of immortality than he might have wished. He became not a hero of righteousness, but a byword for persecution, his name synonymous with false accusation and judicial murder. The title he gave himself, Witchfinder General, became a term of opprobrium, shorthand for those who profit from public fears and private miseries. Yet perhaps there is a final irony in Hopkins' story. His excesses, the sheer scale of his persecutions, helped discredit the very beliefs he claimed to defend. The revulsion at his methods contributed to growing skepticism about witch trials. In trying to root out witchcraft, he may have hastened its demise as a legal and social concern. The Witchfinder General, in the end, may have been the greatest enemy of witch hunting. Matthew Hopkins died as he had lived in Manningtree, the small Essex town where it all began. His body, racked by disease, was laid to rest in ground he had walked as both nobody and nightmare. No marker commemorates his grave, no monument records his passing. He left behind a modest estate, a controversial book, and a legacy written in blood. The England that survived him was changed by his passage through it. Communities that had experienced his investigations carried the trauma for generations. Families broken by accusation and execution never fully healed. The social fabric, once torn, proved difficult to repair. But life continued, as it always does, and gradually the witch panic faded into memory and then into history. Today, Matthew Hopkins is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as a cautionary tale. He shows us how quickly reason can give way to superstition, how easily fear can be weaponized, how readily people can be convinced to turn on their neighbors. He reminds us that the persecution of the vulnerable often comes wrapped in the language of righteousness, that those who claim to protect society may be its greatest threat. The failed lawyer who became the Witchfinder General died young, but his shadow proves persistent. In every demagogue who profits from fear, in every system that manufactures guilt, in every community that turns on its weakest members, we can see the ghost of Matthew Hopkins. He is gone but not forgotten, dead but not departed, a reminder of what humans can do to one another when fear overcomes compassion and certainty excludes mercy. Beneath the soil of modern Europe lies a hidden geography of suffering, where shopping centers now stand, where children play in parks, where farmers tend their fields, there exist the remnants of a darker time. The execution grounds, the gibbet sites, the burial places of those condemned by their own communities. These archaeological sites, long forgotten and only recently rediscovered, tell stories that written records often omitted, stories written in bone and earth, in the positioning of bodies and the artifacts buried with them. In 2008, on a windswept hill called Walkington Wold in Yorkshire, England, archaeologists made a discovery that would reshape our understanding of medieval justice. What began as a routine excavation ahead of a pipeline installation became a window into centuries of communal violence. The bodies they uncovered, 10 young men, their bones bearing the marks of hanging, beheading, and burning, were not war casualties or plague victims. They were the condemned, executed by their communities and buried at this crossroads according to ancient custom. The science of modern archaeology allows us to read these remains like a text, each bone telling its portion of a larger narrative. The young men of Walkington Wold, through isotope analysis of their teeth and bones, revealed origins far from Yorkshire. They had traveled hundreds of miles only to meet their ends on this desolate hill. Some showed signs of hard physical labor. There were patterns on their bones suggesting years of repetitive work. Others bore old injuries, healed fractures that spoke of violent lives before their violent deaths. But it was the manner of their burial that proved most revealing. Positioned at a crossroads, that liminal space where the ancient world believed the supernatural held sway, these bodies were arranged with deliberate care. Some face down, pressed into the earth as if to prevent their spirits from rising. Others were decapitated, their heads placed between their knees or at their feet, a practice meant to confuse any revenant attempting to rise from the grave. The positioning spoke of fear, not just of the crimes these men had committed, but of what they might do after death. The radiocarbon dating revealed that this site had been used for executions across 8 centuries, from the 7th to the 15th century. Generation after generation of communities had brought their condemned to this place, had carried out their sentences, had buried the bodies according to customs that persisted even as languages changed. Kingdoms rose and fell, and new religions swept across the land. The continuity speaks to something deep in human nature, the need to mark the transgressor, to separate them even in death from the community they had wronged. As we examine these remains more closely, patterns emerge that illuminate the practice of community justice. The bodies are overwhelmingly male, predominantly young, between 15 and 25 years old. This demographic profile tells us something about who communities saw as their greatest threats. Young men, particularly those without strong local connections, were the most likely to face terminal justice. The isotope evidence, showing many came from distant regions, suggests these may have been vagrants, migrants, or masterless men, those existing outside the protective bonds of kinship and community. The execution methods varied, but each tells its own story. Hanging, the most common form of death, left its characteristic marks on the cervical vertebrae. Compression fractures where the rope's weight snapped the neck, or in cases of slow strangulation, the abraded bone where the noose gradually crushed the windpipe. These technical details, clinical as they may sound, represent human agony, the final moments of men dying before crowds of their judges. Beheading, reserved for those of higher status or particularly heinous crimes, shows in clean cuts through vertebrae when the executioner was skilled, or in multiple hack marks when the job was botched. One skeleton from Walkington Wold shows 7 separate cuts to the neck, evidence of a horrifically bungled execution. We can imagine the scene, the crowd growing restless, the executioner's panic, the victim's unimaginable suffering before the final blow landed true. But perhaps most disturbing are the bodies showing evidence of burning. Not the clean immolation of witchcraft executions, but partial burning, hands, feet, faces subjected to flame before death. These speak to torture, to the extraction of confessions, to the spectacular nature of medieval justice, where suffering was not merely a side effect, but a central component of the punishment. The Walkington Wold excavation was not unique. Across Europe, similar sites have been uncovered, each adding to our understanding of community justice. At Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, famous for its Anglo-Saxon ship burial, archaeologists discovered a second cemetery, one that tells a very different story from the kingly grave goods of the famous mound. Here, in what has been termed a deviant burial ground, 39 individuals were interred in ways that mark them as outcasts even in death. The Sutton Hoo Execution Cemetery, used from the 8th to the 11th centuries, shows even more elaborate precautions against the return of the dead. Bodies were buried in impossible positions. One man's corpse was folded nearly in half, his head forced down between his knees. Another was buried with large stones placed on his chest and head, weighing down the corpse. Several showed evidence of being staked to the ground with iron spikes driven through their bodies. These practices reflect a worldview where death was not necessarily final, where the executed criminal remained a threat to the community that had condemned him. The crossroads location was chosen deliberately. In folklore, crossroads confused spirits, preventing them from finding their way back to haunt the living. The physical restraints, the stakes, stones, and contorted positions served as supernatural insurance, ensuring that even if the spirit was willing, the flesh would be unable to rise. The artifacts found with these bodies add another layer to our understanding. Unlike normal burials of the period, which often included grave goods for the afterlife, execution burials are marked by absence. No coins for the ferryman, no tools for the next world, no food for the journey. But occasionally, archaeologists find items that speak to the execution itself, corroded iron fragments that prove to be pieces of gibbets, the cages in which bodies were displayed after death. Pottery shards that analysis reveals came from vessels used to collect blood or other bodily substances believed to have magical properties. One particularly haunting discovery came from an execution site near Oxford. Among the remains, archaeologists found a lead tablet, a defixio or curse tablet. Carefully unfolded, it revealed a text in medieval Latin, cursing the executed man's soul to eternal torment and warning others against following his path. The tablet had been placed in the mouth of the severed head, a final silencing that was meant to extend beyond death. The science of modern archaeology allows us to go beyond merely cataloging these finds. DNA analysis has revealed family relationships among some of the executed, suggesting that in certain cases, entire kinship groups face communal justice. At a site in Denmark, 3 bodies buried together proved to be brothers, all showing signs of simultaneous execution. The implications are chilling. A family judged collectively guilty, perhaps under systems like the English Frank Pledge, where relatives bore responsibility for each other's crimes. Pollen analysis from burial sites has revealed seasonal patterns of execution. Spring and autumn predominate, times when communities gather for markets and festivals, when a maximum number of witnesses could observe justice being done. The spectacle was important. Executions served not just to punish the individual, but to instruct the community. The botanical evidence places us in these moments. Spring flowers blooming as the gallows did its work, autumn leaves falling as bodies swung in the wind. The positioning of execution sites themselves tells a story of community boundaries and supernatural geography. They cluster at liminal spaces, crossroads, parish boundaries, the edges of settlements. These were places already associated with danger and transformation, where the ordered world of the community gave way to the chaos of the wilderness. By executing criminals in these spaces, communities reinforced both physical and metaphysical boundaries. Some execution sites show evidence of repeated use over centuries, becoming established features of the landscape. At these locations, archaeologists find evidence of semi-permanent structures, post holes indicating gallows that stood for generations, stone foundations suggesting platforms or viewing areas for spectators. The execution ground became a monument to community justice, a constant reminder of the price of transgression. The treatment of executed bodies varied significantly based on the nature of the crime and the criminal's social status. While common thieves might be buried quickly at the execution site, those guilty of treason or heresy faced post-mortem punishment. Gibbeting, displaying the body in an iron cage until it rotted away, left archaeological traces in the form of gibbet irons and the scattered bones found beneath gibbet sites. One remarkable find from a site in Germany consisted of an intact gibbet cage, its iron bars still holding fragments of bone. Analysis revealed that the body had hung for at least 2 years, through cycles of seasons, becoming a landmark of sorts. Contemporary documents from the area reference the thief at the crossroads as a navigational marker, showing how the executed became integrated into the landscape of daily life. The bones themselves, subjected to modern forensic analysis, revealed details of life before death. Stable isotope analysis can track movement patterns in the years before execution, showing whether the condemned were locals or strangers. Many execution victims show evidence of malnutrition, old injuries, and chronic diseases, painting a picture of marginalized individuals even before their final condemnation. Some bodies bear what archaeologists term overkill injuries, far more violence than necessary to cause death. Multiple sword cuts, evidence of burning, broken bones that occurred around the time of death. These speak to executions that became frenzied events, where community anger overwhelmed the formal procedures of justice. The bones record moments when the crowd became a mob, when execution transformed into lynching. The mystery of identity haunts many of these remains. While some execution victims were recorded in contemporary documents, many more died anonymously, their names lost to history. Archaeologists work to reconstruct what they can approximate age, sex, stature, health status, geographic origin. But the individual human stories, the specific crimes and circumstances that led to these deaths, remain largely unknown. Particularly puzzling are the child burials found at some execution sites. At Walkington Wold, the remains of a boy no more than 10 years old were found, bearing signs of hanging. Medieval law theoretically protected children from capital punishment, yet here was evidence of a child executed and buried among adult criminals. Was this a particularly heinous crime that overrode normal protections? A case of mistaken age? Or evidence that community justice sometimes operated outside even the brutal norms of medieval law? The execution sites also preserve evidence of the spectators who witnessed these deaths. Pottery fragments from drinking vessels, food remains, lost coins, and personal items paint a picture of execution as public spectacle. Some sites show evidence of temporary structures, post holes for tents or stalls, suggesting that execution days became market days, opportunities for commerce alongside justice. At a site in Poland, archaeologists uncovered what appeared to be viewing platforms, raised earthworks facing the gallows site. The community had literally built infrastructure for watching executions, transforming the delivery of justice into a form of theater. The careful construction of sightlines, the provision for large crowds, speaks to the central role these events played in community life. But not all execution burials followed the pattern of disgrace and exclusion. Occasionally, archaeologists find anomalies, executed individuals buried with unexpected care. At a site in France, a beheaded man was found buried with a pilgrim's badge, suggesting someone had performed this act of piety for the condemned. These exceptions hint at the human complexity behind the archaeological remains. Families who loved the executed, communities divided about guilt, small acts of mercy in systems designed for cruelty. The evolution of execution sites over time reveals changing attitudes toward justice and death. Early medieval sites show more evidence of supernatural precautions. The stakes, stones, and impossible burial positions meant to prevent revenants. Later medieval sites, while still showing crossroads locations and separate burial, demonstrate less concern with the walking dead and more with efficient disposal of criminal bodies. By the late medieval period, some execution sites had developed into complex facilities. At a location in the Netherlands, excavation revealed not just gallows and burial grounds, but also structures interpreted as holding cells, viewing platforms, and even what may have been vendor stalls. The delivery of justice had become institutionalized, commercialized, routine. The artifacts found at these sites tell their own stories. Execution swords, marked with makers' stamps, and sometimes decorated with religious or juridical symbols, show the professionalization of the executioner's trade. Some bear tallies, notches recording the number of heads taken. One sword found in Sweden bore the inscription, "When I raise this sword, I wish the sinner eternal life." A chilling reminder that executioners saw themselves as servants of divine as well as earthly justice. Personal items found with bodies occasionally allow for more specific identification. Pilgrim badges, guild tokens, or distinctive jewelry can link remains to historical records. In one case from England, a lead seal found with an executed man identified him as a member of a merchant guild from Lincoln. Records revealed he had been executed for murdering a trade rival. Such connections transform anonymous bones into human stories. The end of the medieval period saw changes in execution practices that left their own archaeological signatures. The rise of professional executioners meant more standardized methods, visible in the consistent placement of cuts on beheaded individuals from later periods. The development of more effective hanging techniques shows in the transition from strangulation deaths to broken necks, a form of progress in the technology of death. Some sites preserve evidence of community resistance to execution. At a location in Scotland, archaeologists found a gallows that had been burned down, its charred posts still in the ground. Historical records confirmed a riot against an unpopular execution, showing that communities did not always acquiesce to the justice carried out in their name. The archaeological record also reveals attempts to memorialize or rehabilitate the executed. At several sites, later burials show evidence of bodies being moved, reburied in more respectful positions, or even transferred to consecrated ground. These posthumous acts of mercy suggest changing attitudes, communities coming to regret their judgments, families finally able to reclaim their dead. Modern development continues to uncover these hidden landscapes of punishment. Each new road, pipeline, or building project has the potential to reveal another execution site, another window into the practice of community justice. The bones that emerge from the earth force us to confront the reality of historical justice. Not the abstract principle, but the physical fact of bodies broken by communal will. The scientific analysis of these remains grows ever more sophisticated. New techniques in DNA analysis promise to reveal more about the geographic origins and family relationships of the executed. Advances in isotope analysis can track dietary changes, potentially revealing how long condemned prisoners were held before execution. Each technological advance allows us to read more clearly the stories written in bone. But what do these buried courts of catastrophe ultimately tell us? They reveal justice as a communal act, participated in and witnessed by entire communities. They show us the excluded, those whose crimes or status place them literally outside the bounds of society. They demonstrate the persistence of supernatural fears alongside practical punishments. Most of all, they remind us that behind every legal system lie human bodies, that abstract principles of justice ultimately resolve into flesh and bone and burial earth. The crossroads where these executions took place still exist, though now they bear traffic lights rather than gallows. The hills where bodies were displayed in gibbets now host cellular towers or wind turbines. The earth that received the condemned now yields its secrets to the archaeologist's trowel. In excavating these sites, we excavate our own history, uncovering the buried violence that underlies our legal traditions. Each skeleton that emerges from these execution grounds was once a living person, someone who loved and was loved, who felt fear and pain, who died at the hands of their community under laws that seemed as natural and immutable as the seasons. Their bones bear witness to systems of justice that required ordinary people to become executioners, that transformed neighbors into instruments of death, that wrote law in suffering and spectacle. The archaeological evidence forces us to see medieval justice not as distant history, but as human experience. The cut marks on vertebrae represent the moment when iron met flesh. The contorted burial positions record the fear of communities who believed their victims might return. The crossroads locations map a geography of exclusion, boundaries between the living and the dead, the community and the condemned. As we uncover more of these sites, as science allows us to read their evidence more clearly, we build a fuller picture of how communities enacted justice when there were no police, no professional courts, no separation between those who judged and those who carried out judgment. The archaeology of execution sites reveals the infrastructure of communal law enforcement, the gallows and gibbets, the burial grounds and viewing platforms, the whole apparatus by which communities police their boundaries through violence. These discoveries continue. Each year brings new excavations, new analyses, new insights into the practice of community justice. The dead continue to emerge from the earth, bearing their testimony in bone and burial position, in artifact and location. They remind us that justice has always been a human creation, enacted by human hands, leaving human remains. The buried courts of catastrophe preserve moments of community, decision-making frozen in time. Here a young man, far from home, met his end because a community judged him threat. There a family faced collective punishment, buried together in shared disgrace. Here someone showed mercy, placing a religious token with the condemned. Their communities enacted their fears, staking bodies to the ground against supernatural return. Modern visitors to these sites, now marked by archaeological interpretation boards, stand where crowds once gathered to watch justice done. The earth beneath their feet holds the remains of those judged and condemned by their ancestors. The peaceful modern landscape overlays a geography of punishment, a map of community violence preserved in bone and soil. The questions these sites raise remain relevant. How do communities define justice? Who decides who belongs and who must be excluded? What fears drive collective punishment? The medieval communities that created these execution landscapes faced these questions with answers that seem brutal to modern sensibilities. Yet the underlying tensions between individual and community, between mercy and justice, between inclusion and exclusion, persist. As archaeological techniques continue to advance, we will undoubtedly uncover more execution sites, more evidence of community justice, more stories preserved in bone and earth. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how human societies have dealt with transgression, how communities have enforced their boundaries, how ordinary people have participated in extraordinary violence. The buried courts of catastrophe remind us that justice is never abstract. It always resolves into physical reality. Bodies constrained, flesh punished, lives ended. The archaeological evidence strips away the centuries, confronting us with the immediate reality of communal law enforcement. In the positioned bones and buried artifacts, we see not distant history, but human choices preserved in earth, awaiting discovery. These sites of execution, mapped across the European landscape, create an alternative geography, not of kingdoms and trade routes, but of community justice and communal fear. Each marks a place where society's boundaries were enforced through ultimate sanction, where belonging was defined by exclusion, where law was written in death and burial. The work of uncovering and interpreting these sites continues, each excavation adding to our understanding of medieval justice. The bones continue to emerge, bearing their silent testimony. The artifacts continue to surface, each adding detail to our picture of community law enforcement. The buried courts of catastrophe continue to yield their secrets, forcing us to confront the violent foundations of communal order. In the end, these archaeological discoveries do more than illuminate the past. They reflect back to us fundamental questions about justice, community, and belonging. The bones of the executed, preserved in earth for centuries, ask us to consider how societies create and enforce their boundaries, how communities decide who belongs and who must be excluded, how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary violence. The crossroads still exist. The communities still gather. The questions of justice remain. What has changed is our willingness to bury the evidence, to forget the violence done in law's name. The archaeological record preserves what human memory would forget, that justice has always been a human creation, enacted by human hands, leaving human remains for future generations to uncover and interpret. In the great city of Paris, in the year 1688, Charles Sanson ascended the scaffold not as a condemned man, but as the newly appointed royal executioner of France. The crowd that gathered to witness his first execution fell silent as this young man, dressed in fine clothes that would have graced a merchant or minor noble, took his position beside the block. The Sanson dynasty had begun, 6 generations of a single family who would hold the exclusive right to execute in the king's name, who would grow wealthy from death, who would transform the brutal necessity of execution into a hereditary privilege as jealously guarded as any noble title. The story of how execution became privilege, how community justice was transformed into elite opportunity, reveals one of history's darkest ironies. The very systems designed to allow communities to police themselves became tools for the powerful to eliminate rivals, seize property, and maintain control through legally sanctioned terror. While common folk faced the harsh reality of collective punishment under systems like the Frank Pledge, the nobility and emerging merchant elite learned to manipulate these same structures for personal gain. Consider the peculiar position of the medieval executioner. In theory, he was the lowest of the low, an untouchable whose profession made him ritually unclean, socially ostracized, feared and despised by the communities he served. Yet in practice, successful executioners often accumulated wealth and influence that many merchants would envy. They held monopolies on certain trades, enjoyed legal privileges denied to ordinary citizens, and in some cases, founded dynasties that lasted centuries. The transformation began in the high medieval period as execution evolved from a communal act, where ordinary citizens took turns serving as executioner to a specialized profession. Cities and kingdoms discovered that amateur executioners often bungled the job, leading to horrific scenes that disturbed public order rather than reinforcing it. A botched beheading that required multiple strokes, a hanging where the condemned slowly strangled rather than dying quickly. These failures of technique undermine the majesty of law. Enter the professional executioner, and with him, a new economy of death. Master Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, whose detailed diary from 1573 to 1617 provides an extraordinary window into this world, executed 361 people and tortured countless others during his career. But execution was only part of his business. As the official executioner, Schmidt held exclusive rights to several profitable sidelines that would seem macabre to modern sensibilities but were considered natural perquisites of his office. First among these was the trade in human bodies and their parts. The executioner owned the corpses of those he killed, and in an age when medical schools desperately needed cadavers for dissection, this represented significant income. Schmidt records selling bodies to the University of Altdorf, carefully negotiating prices based on the condition of corpse. A cleanly beheaded body fetched more than one damaged by torture or burning. But the trade went beyond whole bodies. Popular medicine of the period attributed healing properties to various parts of executed criminals. Human fat, carefully rendered from the corpses, was believed to cure ailments ranging from broken bones to gout. Blood, collected at the moment of death, was thought to treat epilepsy. The executioner's touch itself was believed to have curative powers. Schmidt records being paid to stroke goiters and tumors with the same hands that wielded the sword. The executioner also held monopolies on certain unclean trades that others were forbidden to practice. In many cities, the executioner alone could empty cesspits, remove dead animals from the streets, or operate businesses considered morally dubious, such as bathhouses and brothels. These monopolies, granted as compensation for social ostracism, often proved highly lucrative. The Sansons of Paris grew wealthy not just from executions, but from their exclusive right to remove nice soil from the city's buildings. This economic power created a paradox. Executioners were simultaneously pariahs and persons of substance. They could not enter churches through the main door, yet they often owned fine houses. They were excluded from guilds and social gatherings, yet their children might receive excellent educations. Master Schmidt's son became a successful artist. His daughter married into the respectable bourgeoisie. Money, it seemed, could wash even blood from a family's reputation, at least partially. The hereditary nature of the executioner's office in many regions created dynasties that paralleled noble families. The Sansons served as royal executioners of France from 1688 to 1847 through the ancient regime, the Revolution, the Terror, the Empire, and the Restoration. Each generation passed to the next not just the sword of justice, but the accumulated knowledge of efficient killing, the social connections that protected their privilege, and the wealth that elevated them above common status. Charles-Henri Sanson, who served during the Revolution, exemplified the executioner at the height of his paradoxical power. He lived in a fine house in Paris, employed servants, and moved in educated circles. Voltaire corresponded with him on the nature of justice. Yet he also operated the guillotine during the Terror, executing over 2,700 people, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. His memoirs, though partly fabricated by later writers, capture the strange position of a man who is simultaneously servant and master of justice. The nobility's manipulation of community justice systems extended far beyond their relationships with professional executioners. They discovered that the very structures designed to make communities self-policing could be turned into weapons against enemies and tools for acquiring wealth. The accusation of crimes, particularly those carrying capital punishment and property forfeiture, became a sophisticated art among the elite. Take the case of Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, burned at the stake in 1314. While the charges against him involved heresy and blasphemy, crimes that horrified medieval society, modern historians recognize his execution as the culmination of King Philip IV's campaign to destroy the Templars and seize their vast wealth. The community justice system, with its emphasis on confession and its use of torture, provided the perfect mechanism for juridical murder. The pattern repeated across Europe. A noble coveting his neighbor's estates would arrange accusations of treason. A merchant wanting to eliminate a rival would discover evidence of heresy in his competitor's household. The beauty of the system lay in its use of community participation. Once accusations were made, the machinery of collective justice ground forward inexorably. Neighbors were compelled to search for evidence, to testify to suspicious behavior, to participate in the trial and execution. The manipulation worked through several mechanisms. First, the powerful employed professional accusers, individuals who made their living by identifying criminals and heretics. These men, often former criminals themselves, knew exactly what evidence would secure conviction. They could plant incriminating items, coach witnesses, and construct compelling narratives of guilt. Their services did not come cheap, but for those seeking to eliminate enemies or seize property, they were worth the investment. Second, the elite exploited the financial incentives built into many justice systems. In regions where the property of executed criminals was divided between the accuser, the court, and the crown, false accusations became profitable investments. A successful prosecution might yield lands, buildings, trade goods, and coin. The accuser who initiated proceedings often received the largest share, making judicial murder a form of hostile takeover. The case of the merchant families of Augsburg in the late 15th century illustrates this dynamic perfectly. The Fuggers, rising bankers who would eventually finance emperors, systematically used accusations of fraud and usury against their competitors. By deploying the community justice system against rival banking houses, they eliminated competition while acquiring their assets. The beauty of the scheme lay in its legality. Everything was done according to law, with proper procedures followed and community participation ensured. Third, the nobility exploited their roles as judges and judicial administrators. While they could not directly condemn their enemies that required community participation, they could shape the process in countless ways. They appointed the officials who investigated crimes, selected the juries that heard cases, and influenced the interpretation of evidence. A word from a powerful lord about his concerns regarding a neighbor could set in motion a chain of events leading inexorably to the scaffold. The corruption of community justice reached its apex in the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. While popular imagination pictures witch hunts as eruptions of mass hysteria, careful historical analysis reveals the calculating hand of elite manipulation. Property-owning women, particularly widows, faced disproportionate accusations. Their estates, free from male control, represented tempting targets for acquisition. The Prince Bishopric of Bamberg, under Prince Bishop Johann George Fuchs von Dornheim, witnessed some of the most systematic witch persecutions in European history. Between 1626 and 1631, over 600 people were executed for witchcraft. But examination of the victims reveals a pattern. Many were wealthy burghers, their property confiscated upon conviction. The Prince Bishop built a new residence, the Witch's House, funded entirely by confiscated wealth. Community justice had become a revenue stream. The executioners who carried out these manipulated sentences occupied a unique position in the system. They knew, often better than anyone, when justice was being perverted for personal gain. Master Schmidt's diary contains veiled references to executions he believed unjust, though he carried them out nonetheless. The executioner served whoever paid him, but he was not blind to the machinations of his employers. This knowledge gave executioners a peculiar form of power. They knew the secrets of the powerful, who had arranged false accusations, who had profited from judicial murder, who feared exposure of their own crimes. This dangerous knowledge required careful management. Executioners who spoke too freely might find themselves facing the scaffold from the other side. But those who managed their position skillfully could leverage their knowledge for protection and profit. The daily routine of an elite manipulator of justice followed predictable patterns. Morning would bring meetings with informants and spies, gathering intelligence on potential targets. Which merchant had grown too wealthy? Which noble widow controlled estates that might be better managed by others? Which rival showed signs of vulnerability? Information was currency in the economy of accusation. Afternoons might be spent in careful legal preparation. Despite the corruption of the system, forms had to be observed. Evidence needed to be documented, witnesses prepared, legal precedent cited. The elite employed lawyers skilled in the manipulation of community justice, men who understood how to present accusations in ways that would compel community action. Evenings brought social gatherings where the real business was conducted. Over wine and feast, deals were struck about who would support which accusations, how proceeds would be divided, which officials needed to be bribed or threatened. These gatherings, held in the same halls where justice was supposedly administered, reveal the intimate connection between social power and judicial murder. The executioner dynasties participated in this social world in their own peculiar way. Excluded from normal gatherings, they nonetheless held their own courts. Those seeking their services, whether for execution, torture, or the medical treatments they provided, came to them. In the executioner's house, noble and commoner alike revealed their needs and fears, creating networks of obligation and knowledge that the wise executioner carefully cultivated. The Sansons of Paris exemplified this cultivation of connection. By the 18th century, they moved in enlightened circles, discussing the philosophy of punishment with the same intellectuals who would eventually abolish the systems that enriched them. Charles-Henri Sanson reportedly opposed the death penalty even as he operated the guillotine, a position that seems paradoxical until we realize that his opposition enhanced his social standing among reformers, while his continued service ensured his family's prosperity. The manipulation of community justice created its own ecosystem of corruption. Judges who took bribes to ensure convictions, witnesses who sold their testimony to the highest bidder, torturers who guaranteed confessions for a price, guards who allowed the wealthy to escape before execution for suitable compensation. Each participant justified their corruption by pointing to others. If everyone was corrupt, no individual bore full responsibility. This system persisted because it served multiple interests. The crown gained revenue from confiscations and fines. The nobility eliminated rivals and acquired property. The emerging merchant class could buy their way into power by financing prosecutions. Even common folk might profit by serving as informants or witnesses. The community justice system, designed to create collective responsibility, instead created collective corruption. The records of the period preserve occasional moments of resistance. Communities that refused to convict despite pressure from above. Juries that found ways to acquit those they knew were falsely accused. Crowds that rioted when particularly egregious injustices were attempted. But these moments were rare. The system's genius lay in making everyone complicit. It was difficult to protest injustices in which you had participated. The executioner's privilege extended beyond mere economics to social mobility of a peculiar kind. While never fully accepted in polite society, successful executioner families occupied a unique niche. They were needed by the powerful, feared by the common, and wealthy enough to insulate themselves from the worst effects of social ostracism. Some, like the Reich Hearts of Bavaria, who served from the 17th to the 20th century, saw family members enter respectable professions even as others continued the bloody trade. The medical privileges of executioners deserve particular attention. In an age when human dissection was restricted and medical knowledge limited, executioners possessed unique anatomical expertise. They knew exactly where to cut to cause instant death or prolonged suffering. They understood which bones would break under specific pressures, how much blood loss a person could survive, where to apply hot irons for maximum pain with minimum fatal damage. This knowledge made them valuable to physicians and scholars. Andreas Vesalius, the father of modern anatomy, learned from executioners. Medical students paid executioners for lessons in practical anatomy. The executioner's touch, believed to heal, brought paying customers seeking cures. Some executioners, like Franz Schmidt, maintained medical practices that rivaled those of university-trained physicians. The noble manipulation of justice reached its most sophisticated form in the creation of special courts and jurisdictions. The Spanish Inquisition, the witch courts of Germany, the treason tribunals of England, each represented an evolution beyond simple community justice. These institutions maintained the fiction of community participation while ensuring elite control. They employed professional prosecutors, used standardized procedures for obtaining confessions, and operated with efficiency that community justice could never achieve. The Court of Star Chamber in England exemplifies this evolution. Originally designed to ensure justice in cases where common law courts might be corrupted, it became itself an instrument of royal oppression. Meeting in secret, using torture despite English common law prohibitions, it turned the forms of justice into tools of tyranny. The noble defendants who faced it often found themselves condemned by the very procedures they had used against others. The economic impact of elite manipulation of justice extended far beyond individual fortunes gained or lost. Entire regions could be impoverished by systematic prosecutions. The witch hunts of Würzburg and Bamberg didn't just destroy individuals. They disrupted trade networks, created labor shortages, and undermined social trust essential for commerce. The short-term gains of the prosecutors came at devastating long-term costs to society. Yet the system persisted because those who profited from it controlled the mechanisms of reform. Why would nobles who enriched themselves through false accusations support changes that would end their profits? Why would executioner dynasties that had grown wealthy from death support abolition of capital punishment? Why would corrupt judges and prosecutors dismantle the systems that supported them? Change, when it came, arose from multiple sources. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about justice and human rights. The Protestant Reformation challenged the religious authorities that had sanctioned many abuses. The rise of centralized nation-states created new forms of law enforcement that didn't depend on community participation. Economic changes made the seizure of property through judicial murder less attractive compared to other forms of wealth accumulation. The executioner dynasties adapted to these changes with remarkable flexibility. The Sansons transitioned from sword to guillotine, presenting the new device as humane and progressive. The Reichards of Bavaria continued their trade into the 20th century, with Johann Reichardt executing over 3,000 people for various German states, including the Nazi regime. The profession that had begun in medieval community justice survived into the age of totalitarian state terror. The legacy of elite manipulation of community justice extends beyond historical curiosity. It reveals how systems designed for collective security can be perverted for individual gain. It shows how the forms of law can be preserved while its substance is corrupted. It demonstrates how economic incentives can transform justice into injustice while maintaining procedural propriety. Modern legal systems, with their professional police, independent prosecutors, and appellate courts, arose partly in response to the corruptions of community justice. The separation of accusation from prosecution, the presumption of innocence, the right to counsel. These innovations address specific abuses of the older system. Yet the fundamental tension between community standards and elite manipulation remains. The figure of the executioner, enriched by death and elevated by exclusion, serves as a powerful symbol of these contradictions. Neither fully outcast nor fully accepted, wielding power while remaining powerless, wealthy yet untouchable. The executioner embodied the paradoxes of a justice system that served multiple masters. Their dynasties, lasting centuries, remind us that institutions of death can be remarkably durable. As we reflect on these histories of privilege and manipulation, we might consider what modern equivalents exist. What current systems of justice might future historians identify as serving elite interests while maintaining facades of community participation? What forms of legal manipulation persist despite reforms? The executioner's privilege may be extinct, but the dynamics that created it, the intersection of law, power, and profit, remain very much alive. The great houses built by executioner dynasties still stand in some European cities, transformed now into museums or offices or apartments. The fortunes accumulated through judicial murder have long since been dispersed through inheritance and investment. The names of those who manipulated justice for gain are mostly forgotten, recorded only in archives that few consult. But the lessons of their corruption remain relevant. Justice, these histories remind us, is not an abstract principle, but a human practice susceptible to all the corruptions that flesh is heir to. Community participation in law enforcement, while seeming to ensure fairness, can be perverted into community complicity in injustice. Professional administration of justice, while addressing some corruptions, creates new opportunities for manipulation. The price of justice, like that of freedom, is eternal vigilance. The executioner's privilege has ended. The dynasties of death have disbanded. The scaffolds have been dismantled, and the guillotines retired to museums. But the human capacity to transform systems of justice into instruments of profit remains. In that sense, the shadow of the executioner still falls across our legal systems, reminding us that law without conscience is merely organized violence, and justice without mercy is just another name for revenge. In the end, the story of how execution became privilege, how community justice was corrupted by elite manipulation, serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that every legal system reflects the society that creates it, with all its inequalities and opportunities for exploitation. It shows how those with power will always seek to bend justice to their own ends, using the very mechanisms designed to ensure fairness as tools of oppression. The communities that once gathered to witness executions have dispersed. The elite who manipulated justice for profit have passed into history. The executioners who grew rich from death have laid down their swords and axes. But the questions their histories raise remain. How do we create justice systems that serve all rather than few? How do we prevent the powerful from corrupting the mechanisms of law? How do we ensure that community participation in justice leads to fairness rather than complicity in oppression? These questions echo through the centuries, as relevant today as when the first executioner transformed community service into family privilege, when the first noble realized that accusation could be more profitable than agriculture, when the first judge took gold to ensure a guilty verdict. The executioner's privilege may be history, but the dynamics that created it remain part of the human condition, awaiting only opportunity to manifest again in new forms.